The desert seemed to hold its breath. April 2003. The sun rose like a blast furnace over the sands of central Iraq, casting waves of heat that shimmered across the barren plains. The horizon quivered in the distance, a mirage of silence and fire. But every man in the U.S. Army's 3rd Infantry Division knew the truth. The road ahead was death waiting in ambush. They were pushing through the Karbala Gap, a narrow, deadly funnel of terrain where geography, history, and strategy converged in a crucible of war. The 3rd ID, bloodied and battle-tested, had clawed its way north from Kuwait through weeks of punishing combat. They'd fought in Najaf and Diwania, stormed across bridges under fire, and watched as the desert swallowed the dead. Dust coated every inch of their bodies, inside their uniforms, in their teeth, in the very folds of their souls. The tanks and Bradleys they rode had become part of them, machines fused with muscle and instinct. But now, with Baghdad just days away, they faced one final trial, a stretch of land that commanders called the Gauntlet and soldiers called the Meat Grinder, the Karbala Gap. To the west lay Lake Mill, vast, shallow, and unnavigable. To the east, the Euphrates River carved its path through civilization's cradle, bordered by marshlands, narrow causeways, and the ancient city of Karbala itself. Between these two natural barriers stretched a thin corridor of open desert and hard-packed roadways. It was the only viable route for a mechanized assault into Baghdad from the south, and Saddam's generals knew it. Every battlefield calculation pointed to this corridor. It was here, if anywhere, that the Iraqis would try to halt the American advance. For the U.S. Army, the geography was unforgiving. No flanking routes, no alternate highways, no cover. The only option was straight ahead. A direct thrust through the gap into the jaws of a dug-in enemy that had been waiting for weeks. The intelligence coming in was grim. Recon drones picked up Iraqi armor and artillery lining the outskirts of Karbala. Signals intercepts confirmed the presence of Republican Guard units, Saddam's elite, heavily armed troops, along with irregular Fedayeen fighters, fanatical paramilitaries known for their ruthlessness. Some reports hinted at chemical weapons. Others spoke of ambushes and massed RPG teams in the ruins of outlying villages. Colonel David Perkins, commander of the 2nd Brigade, Task Force Thunder, understood the stakes. A full stop in the Karbala Gap could paralyze the entire invasion. Delay meant more than lost time. It meant exposed flanks, stalled logistics, and the risk of encirclement. The order was clear: breakthrough at any cost. But no one underestimated what lay ahead. Inside Abrams tanks, crews ran final checks: turrets, comms, AP rounds, coaxial machine guns. Bradley IFV gunners tightened their straps, scanned optics, and whispered quiet prayers. Paladins moved into position, ready to provide Overwatch artillery support. AH-64 Apaches prowled above, sweeping the corridor with Hellfires and 30mm cannon. Every man in the column knew what this would be: a dash through hell. As the operation commenced, the lead elements surged forward in tight formation, engines roaring like a steel avalanche. Dust rose in choking clouds behind them. The desert trembled. Then the first resistance came, sporadic at first, then vicious. Mortars rained down from concealed positions. RPGs screamed in from tree lines and rooftops. Machine gun fire lit up from sandbagged berms. The Republican Guard had dug in hard. But the Americans had momentum and overwhelming firepower. The response was brutal. Abrams tanks returned fire with pinpoint precision, their 120mm guns tearing through bunkers and enemy armor. Bradleys deployed dismount teams, who cleared trenches and buildings with grenades and M4s. Apache gunships dove in low, unleashing hell from above. The gap became a churning maelstrom of smoke, flame, and thunder. In one sector, Iraqi T-72 tanks attempted a flank assault, rushing in from the east to catch the column in crossfire. But U.S. scouts spotted the move early. Within minutes, the T-72s were smoldering wrecks, destroyed by a combination of airstrikes and anti-tank missiles. In another engagement, a group of Fedayeen charged an American convoy head-on, screaming and firing wildly. They were cut down in seconds. The Karbala Gap was turning into a killing field, but not for the Americans. Still, the cost was not light. Several vehicles were hit by IEDs buried in the sand. One Bradley was immobilized by an RPG and had to be abandoned under fire. Medics worked frantically to stabilize wounded soldiers, even as the battle raged around them. Apache crews reported taking small arms hits to their rotors. Fuel trucks were forced to maneuver under incoming fire to keep the advance from stalling. But the push did not stop. Hour after hour, the third ID advanced, burning through ammunition, fuel, and resistance. The deeper they drove, the clearer it became. The Iraqis had prepared for a stand, but not for this level of speed and violence. The psychological impact of the assault was shattering enemy lines before bullets could. By nightfall, elements of the 2nd Brigade had cleared the gap. The Republican Guard was shattered. Fedayeen units had either fled or died in place. The corridor, once a potential death trap, was now a cleared highway. The way to Baghdad lay open. As exhausted troops set up perimeter security and resupplied under the stars, the gravity of what they'd accomplished began to sink in. The Karbala Gap, once thought to be a potential site of disaster, had become a symbol of audacity and overwhelming force. But the cost lingered. Casualty reports filtered in. Letters were written home by flashlight, dog tags collected, names whispered. Silence stretched across the desert. In the distance, the faint glow of Baghdad lit the horizon. The final chapter of the invasion was about to begin. The war had begun with fire and fury. In the early hours of March 20th, 2003, Operation Iraqi Freedom roared to life with a series of precision airstrikes meant to decapitate Saddam Hussein's regime before the first American boots even touched the ground. Cruise missiles screamed into Baghdad from U.S. Navy ships in the Persian Gulf. Their targets, government bunkers, communications hubs, and military installations, erupting in pillars of flame. Shock and awe, they called it. The doctrine was simple: strike hard, strike fast, and crush the will to fight before a proper defense could form. But war, like history, rarely follows doctrine. From the south, a vast mechanized force surged across the Kuwaiti border. Abrams tanks, Bradley fighting vehicles, Humvees, and armored troop carriers kicking up walls of dust that stretched to the horizon. The U.S. Army's 3rd Infantry Division was the tip of this spear, smashing through the first lines of Iraqi resistance with ruthless efficiency. Alongside them were British forces, Marine units, and airborne divisions, forming a multi-pronged assault designed to rip through the Iraqi heartland with overwhelming firepower and speed. Within days, battles erupted in the cities of Basra and Nasiriyah. In Basra, British forces engaged in fierce urban combat as Iraqi defenders and Fedayeen paramilitaries tried to slow their advance. In Nasiriyah, Marines fought through ambushes, sniper fire, and chaos to secure vital bridges, their movements haunted by the fear of booby traps and the specter of close-quarters fighting. These were not simple missions. They were brutal and exhausting, often fought block by block. But still, the coalition advanced. Washington was watching the clock. Pentagon planners knew the longer the war dragged on, the greater the risk. Intelligence suggested that Saddam might resort to chemical or biological weapons if he felt cornered. Every delay increased the chances of a desperate last move. Nerve agents deployed by artillery, gas attacks in the cities, or even Scud missile strikes with chemical payloads. Worse still, the longer the campaign went on, the more likely Iraq's tribal militias and Ba'athist loyalists would fade into the population, blending with civilians and morphing into an insurgency. The decision was made. Baghdad had to fall, and soon. But Baghdad was not an open gate. It was a fortress wrapped in concentric rings of defenses, both natural and man-made. To reach it, coalition forces would have to breach the Karbala Gap. For many, the name meant little, but for those in uniform, it carried a weight. The Karbala Gap was a bottleneck, a 25-mile-wide corridor between the Euphrates River on the east and the vast salt lake of Razaza to the west. It was the only feasible route for heavy armor to punch through to Baghdad without attempting a costly river crossing or a wide flanking maneuver that would expose supply lines. But the gap was narrow, easily observed, and easily defended. Natural choke points like these were the stuff of military textbooks, places where a smaller force, if properly prepared, could inflict devastating casualties, and Saddam's generals knew it. Reports from CYA and military intelligence warned that the Iraqi command had fortified the area with bunkers, trench lines, and artillery emplacements. Republican Guard units, including the vaunted Medina Division, were believed to be entrenched around Karbala itself, ready to unleash fire on any force reckless enough to charge through. The terrain gave defenders the advantage. A well-placed minefield, a few hidden tanks, or a battery of anti-tank missiles could bring even a division to a grinding halt. Still, the order came down. Push through the gap. At the forefront of the operation was Task Force 369 Armor, led by Lieutenant Colonel David Perkins. These were warriors already tested in the crucible of battle. They'd fought in Najaf, Kifl, and across the southern highways, cutting down resistance and opening the path for the main invasion. Their M1 Abrams tanks had proven nearly invincible in open combat. Their Bradleys had moved like knife blades through the streets. But the Karbala Gap would be different. Supporting them were elements of the 101st Airborne Division, light infantry specialists who would be airlifted behind enemy lines to seize and hold key terrain. Engineers were attached to clear mines and bridge obstacles. Artillery units stood ready to unleash steel rain on fortified Iraqi positions. Attack helicopters, including Apaches and Kiowas, flew ahead to scout enemy positions and eliminate threats. Air Force bombers and fighters patrolled the skies, launching precision strikes against suspected strongholds. Overseeing the entire operation was Major General Buford Blount, commander of the 3rd Infantry Division. A deliberate and experienced officer, Blount understood the importance of speed, but he also knew the cost of recklessness. His division would be the fist that punched through the Karbala Gap. Failure was not an option. The days leading up to the assault were tense. Troops reviewed maps by red flashlight under camouflage netting. Pilots studied satellite imagery and received last-minute weather briefings. Tanks were topped off with fuel and ammo. Artillery units calibrated their fire missions. Comms specialists coordinated with CENTCOM and coalition partners. At every level, soldiers were preparing for what many believed could be the decisive engagement of the war. And always, in the background, loomed the fear of the unknown. Would Saddam unleash chemical weapons in the Gap? Would the Medina Division fight to the death? Would suicide attacks and ambushes bleed the American advance dry before it could reach Baghdad? No one could answer those questions. But they were going to find out. Mile by mile, firefight by firefight. The Karbala Gap wasn't just a patch of ground. It was a test of resolve. A place where the U.S. Army's doctrine of speed, power, and coordination would be put to the ultimate test. Every soldier who boarded a Bradley or climbed into an Abrams knew it. They weren't just advancing, they were entering the crucible. The road to Baghdad went through the Karbala Gap, and nothing would stop them from getting there. The defenders of the Karbala Gap were not idle. They had seen the columns of American armor slicing through the south, through Najaf, through Kifl, leaving shattered barracks, burning vehicles, and stunned prisoners in their wake. The Republican Guard had watched, waited, and prepared. They knew this moment was coming. Baghdad was just beyond the horizon, and the only thing standing between the capital and the might of the U.S. Army was them. The Medina Division, Saddam's most elite armored corps, had been ordered to hold the line. They were dug in across the narrow corridor, their positions spread between concealed berms, shallow trench lines, and camouflaged artillery nests buried under the tree lines. Along the palm groves and riverbanks, anti-aircraft batteries had been carefully positioned, ZSU-23 Shilkas, SA-6 gainful missile launchers, and shoulder-fired SA-7s, all hidden beneath sheets of camouflage netting and palm fronds, waiting for the helicopters they knew would come. These were not mere conscripts. These were hardened veterans of the Iran-Iraq War, men who had once stood toe-to-toe with Iranian armor and survived the War of the Cities. Their Soviet-era tanks may have been aging, but their resolve was not. Their discipline was ruthless. They'd been promised glory. They were told Baghdad would never fall. And here, in the last defensible stretch before the capital, they would make their stand. But the Medina Division wasn't alone. Operating in the shadows, in the alleyways, on the rooftops, and in the dark corners of Karbala were the Fedayeen Saddam Hussein's irregular paramilitary force. Fanatics, loyal to the point of death, the Fedayeen were not interested in formal engagements. They were the dagger in the dark, the explosive belt hidden beneath a civilian shirt, the masked figure behind a second-story window with an RPG aimed at a tank's rear flank. Armed with AK-47s, Dragunov sniper rifles, RPG-7s, and IEDs made from cooking gas canisters, they didn't just prepare for battle, they prepared to die. Civilians had long since fled or been coerced into silence. Empty homes became firing positions. Mosques, schools, and apartment buildings turned into fortified bunkers. Roadways were rigged with daisy-chained explosives. Overpasses had tripwires and kill zones mapped with methodical precision. Fedayeen spotters, disguised as civilians, moved among the ruins and the roadside markets, relaying positions by radio or shouting from rooftops. Some carried satchels filled with grenades. Others wore vests packed with ball bearings and high explosives, destined for martyrdom. Every alley was a potential ambush. Every silhouette might be a Fedayeen. Every vehicle that stopped too long risked being bracketed by mortar fire. As the 3rd Infantry Division pushed northward, its scouts and forward observers worked feverishly to unmask the hidden defenders. UAVs flew high above the battlefield, their infrared cameras capturing bursts of movement in the undergrowth. Sudden glints of metal, the slow crawl of an anti-tank team moving into position, the telltale flicker of heat signatures clustered near intersections. Satellite reconnaissance confirmed what the ground troops feared. The area was saturated with fighting positions, most of them camouflaged, some buried entirely underground with just enough visibility to fire and reload. In response, American attack helicopters took to the skies. AH-64 Apaches from the 11th Aviation Regiment flew low and fast across the tree lines and canals, hunting for tanks and artillery. Their Hellfire missiles struck with frightening accuracy, blowing open bunkers and silencing gun pits. But the enemy was no stranger to this kind of fight. They returned fire with a fury, machine guns from rooftops, RPGs launched in volleys, and concentrated anti-aircraft fire from concealed batteries. In one particularly intense contact, an Apache squadron probing near the Euphrates encountered a coordinated ambush. As the helicopters banked over a grove of palm trees, tracers lit up the sky. Dozens of AK-47s opened fire. SA-7s streaked skyward. RPGs burst like fireworks in the air. When the squadron returned to base, multiple helicopters were riddled with holes, canopy glass spider-webbed, tail rotors damaged, fuselages scarred with shrapnel. Several had to be grounded. Pilots had narrowly avoided disaster. The message was clear. The Iraqis weren't just waiting in hiding, they were hunting. Across the radios, the tension was palpable. Intel analysts intercepted panicked Iraqi transmissions, field commanders urging reinforcements, reporting American positions, or requesting fire missions. The Americans had learned by now that while the Iraqi command structure was rigid and often inefficient, the lower-level commanders were anything but passive. Improvisation was common. Local officers retasked troops, moved artillery without orders, and used the civilian landscape to their advantage. This wasn't just a static defense, it was a coordinated kill zone. Chemical weapons remained a constant fear. Earlier reconnaissance flights had picked up suspicious heat signatures along the irrigation ditches and canals near the western edge of the Gap. Some analysts believed they were underground bunkers, possibly weapons storage sites. Others feared the worst: chemical warheads. Teams on the ground approached with caution. MOPP gear was checked and rechecked. Sensors sniffed the air for nerve agents or mustard gas. But no confirmation came. Whether the Iraqis still held chemical weapons or had moved them elsewhere remained a mystery. But the psychological effect lingered over every patrol. In the face of this, the Third ID pressed forward. Engineers cleared paths through suspected minefields. Infantry units secured bridges and intersections under fire. Artillery lit up the night with coordinated barrages, pounding tree lines and suspected fighting positions with 155mm shells. Close air support screamed overhead, F-15Es and A-10 Warthogs, unloading everything from JDAMs to Maverick missiles onto enemy armor. The Medina Division struck back with what they had: old T-72 tanks lurking in concealed revetments, popping out to fire a shot before disappearing again. Mortar teams shifted constantly, never staying in one place long enough to be bracketed. Snipers operated in teams, firing once and then melting away into the ruins of farmhouses and empty villages. They knew the ground, and they used every inch of it. But the American war machine was relentless. Each engagement was met with overwhelming firepower. Each ambush answered by airstrikes or the thunder of 120mm shells from Abrams tanks. Yet the closer the Third ID got to Baghdad, the more vicious the fighting became. The Iraqi defenders, desperate to buy time for Baghdad's final preparations, fought like men with nothing left to lose. And in many ways, they didn't. For the soldiers of the 3rd Infantry Division, this wasn't just another leg of the journey. It was a crucible. The Karbala Gap was no longer just a narrow stretch of desert. It was a gauntlet of fire, steel, and shadows. Every mile gained was paid for in sweat, blood, and noise. And still, the columns rolled forward, grinding, rumbling, unstoppable. The gates of Baghdad were drawing near. The approach began in earnest on April 2nd. Task Force 369 began the push, forming up their Abrams tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles into armored columns. M1A1 Abrams, 66 tons of American steel, led the charge, supported by M2 Bradleys bristling with 25mm cannons. Kiowa and Apache helicopters hovered overhead, scanning the terrain with infrared sensors. The attack began under the cover of darkness, a tactic that had become a trademark of the U.S. offensive. At 0300 hours, artillery began pounding suspected Iraqi positions with 155mm shells. The sky turned orange in the distance, and the ground trembled with the echo of explosions. Soldiers clutched their rifles tighter, adrenaline rising with every distant thud. Then, they moved. The first few miles were deceptively calm. Sand blew gently across the highway. The silence was unsettling. As they approached a series of irrigation canals, the first shots rang out. Iraqi troops hidden in the brush opened up with machine guns and RPGs. An Abrams took a hit on its turret, not penetrated but enough to rattle its crew. The tanks returned fire with deadly precision. High explosive shells tore into the enemy positions, reducing palm trees and fighters alike to ash. The battle had begun. Fedayeen fighters, many dressed as civilians, launched ambushes with suicidal resolve, One ran straight at a Bradley with a satchel charge before being cut down. Another group used civilian cars as mobile cover, firing from behind windshields. Snipers had taken positions inside abandoned buildings, forcing American troops to clear each structure painstakingly. Combat engineers worked quickly, blowing bridges to deny enemy movement and clearing roadside bombs with robots or by hand. Further along the corridor, an entire Republican Guard platoon attempted a counterattack using T-72 tanks and BMP fighting vehicles. It was a desperate move. The T-72s, relics of Soviet engineering, were no match for American firepower. A single Abrams tank engaged 3 T-72s at once, knocking out all of them in less than a minute. One shot struck a T-72's ammo cache, setting off a secondary explosion that lit up the night sky. By dawn on April 3rd, the U.S. forces had punched through the first line of defense. But the battle wasn't over. The weather turned. A massive sandstorm, the worst in years, swept across the region. Visibility dropped to almost zero. GPS signals began to flicker, and communications grew difficult. Soldiers wrapped scarves around their faces. The storm grounded air support. Suddenly, the army was fighting blind. The Iraqis tried to take advantage, launching mortars and probing attacks under the cover of dust. But the Americans held. Despite the storm, the 3rd Infantry Division kept moving. Soldiers navigated by map and memory. Tanks used their thermal sights to identify threats in the stormy haze. The grit got into everything: rifles, engines, lungs. But the advance didn't stop. When the storm passed, reconnaissance units pushed ahead. They reported bridges intact, villages abandoned, and signs that the Iraqis were retreating. But intelligence suggested they were falling back toward Baghdad to make a final stand. At dawn on April 4th, the 3rd Infantry Division emerged from the Karbala Gap. They had broken through. Ahead of them lay the final obstacle: the approach to Baghdad. The Euphrates was behind them. The Medina Division, once considered elite, had been shattered. Hundreds of Iraqi soldiers surrendered. Others fled in civilian clothes. American forces paused only briefly to resupply before the final push. In the following days, they would launch the famed Thunder Runs, lightning-fast armored raids straight into the heart of Baghdad. But it was the battle for the Karbala Gap that had cracked the shell. The battle left behind burned-out vehicles, craters, and the bodies of those who refused to surrender. It also left behind questions. Why had Saddam allowed his best forces to be slaughtered in a narrow trap? Why had they not used chemical weapons as feared? Historians would debate these points, but for the soldiers of the 3rd ID, the answers mattered less than the fact that they had survived. For many, the memories of the gap would haunt them for years. The ambushes, the sounds of RPGs bouncing off armor, the thunder of return fire, the eerie silence between battles, the fear of being hit by a weapon you couldn't see. The Karbala Gap was a graveyard of resistance and a corridor of destiny. It was there that the fate of Baghdad was sealed, not in the palaces of the capital, but in the dust and fire of the desert. The men who fought through it didn't seek glory. They sought to finish what they had started, to remove a tyrant, to complete their mission, and to go home. But war doesn't let go so easily. Even after Baghdad fell, the insurgency would rise. Even after statues were toppled, chaos would bloom. But for a moment, in April 2003, as tanks rolled through the dust and soldiers raised the stars and stripes over a captured outpost, victory felt real, tangible, earned, and it had passed through the Karbala Gap.